The rich man kept his routine in Maine as the designer woman changed the space. Morning in this part of Maine did not arrive all at once. It edged in slowly, a gray pressure against wood and glass. Fog rested low enough to soften outlines, high enough to let movement register. The harbor was there without showing itself. Sound traveled differently in weather like this, flattened and patient, as if the town had agreed to speak quietly until further notice. Caleb Rowan walked the same stretch of road he walked every morning. The timing was exact without being checked. His coat was buttoned. His hands were empty. His pace did not change for the weather. He passed the same closed bookstore, the same bench that waited for the bus that came when it came, the same curve where the road bent toward the water and then away again. Across the street, a narrow shop held its light. Inside, Iris Calder stood just behind the front window. The door was closed but not locked. The sign faced inward, unreadable from a street. She adjusted the display with movements that were almost still. One hand lifted a piece of fabric and shifted it less than an inch. The other hand steadied the frame. Light moved across the surface, caught briefly, then settled. She stepped back, waited, adjusted it again. The change did not announce itself. It corrected something only she had felt was off. Outside, Caleb slowed by half a step. Not enough to stop walking. Enough to register that he was being held in place by something he was not touching. He did not cross the street. He did not lean closer to the glass. He stood where the sidewalk widened, facing forward, his attention resting on the window without fixing on any detail inside it. The reflection of the fog layered itself over the display. For a moment, his outline appeared in the glass, thin and broken by light. A pickup truck passed between them, tires whispering on damp pavement. When the sound cleared, the space returned exactly as it had been. Inside, Iris noticed the reflection, not as a person yet, as movement, as weight where weight had not been before. She lifted her eyes. Caleb looked up at the same moment. Their gaze met through the glass, through fog, through the shallow distance the street allowed. It did not hold. It did not ask to be answered. It registered, then released like water pulling back from a dock without taking anything with it. Iris did not smile. She did not look away either. She lifted her hand once, not toward him, but toward the corner of the display where the light had shifted again. She corrected it. When her hand lowered, the balance held. Caleb nodded, as if to the window itself. Then he stepped back half a pace. He did not leave. The fog shifted, thinning near the ground. A gull called somewhere beyond sight. The sound stretched and flattened by the damp air. A woman walking her dog slowed at the curb. She looked at the window, then at Caleb, then back at the window. The dog tugged forward, impatient. She said nothing. She walked on. Inside, Iris turned away from the glass and returned to her work table. She opened a notebook, glanced at the page, then closed it again without writing. The heater clicked on briefly, then off. Outside, Caleb glanced at his watch. Not because he was late, because time had passed. The street resumed its quiet motion. A door opened farther down. Someone swept a step, knowing the wind would undo it by noon. The harbor breathed in slow, even rhythm just beyond sight. Later, people would remember the dress in the window, or the fog, or the way the morning felt heavier than usual. Few would remember the exact distance between the shop and the sidewalk. Fewer still would remember that no one crossed it. But the space had been seen, not commented on, not claimed, just noticed. And in a town that understood how to look without asking, that was enough to let the day continue. For now, the town revealed itself slowly once the morning settled. Maine did not offer clear edges in winter light. It worked in layers, gray over gray, which softened by salt, air heavy with moisture that never quite turned into rain. The cold was present without urgency, seeping into coats and seams, staying longer than expected. The coastal road curved the way it always had, following land instead of correcting it. Houses leaned into the wind with familiarity. Wooden siding showed years of weather, paint worn thin where hands had rested, steps hollowed slightly by repetition. Nothing looked newly repaired, even when it was. Fixes, here were meant to hold, not announce themselves. Down by the dock, the water moved in even pulses. No crashing surf, no spectacle, just the steady lift and settle against pilings that had learned to listen. Ropes creaked softly. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching light in dull threads. Boats came in low, engines restrained, as if sound itself respected the hour. Fog lingered along the surface of things. It softened the harbor first, then the road, then faces. Sound carried farther, but landed gently. A gull called somewhere out of sight. The cry stretched thin by damp air. You could not always see the bird. You always knew it was there. The town woke without announcement. A diner door opened and closed. A bell rang once, then stopped. Chairs scraped. Coffee filled cups. Someone swept a sidewalk, knowing the wind would undo it by noon. A delivery truck idled longer than needed, exhaust dissolving into gray. Rough outside, gentle inside. It was not a philosophy spoken aloud. It was a way of moving through the day. Caleb Rowan passed through these spaces without altering them. He walked the same routes at the same hours. Not because he needed to, but because the town responded best to consistency. He stopped when he needed to stop. He waited when waiting made sense. No one hurried him. No one slowed for him either. At the dock, he stood near the edge and watched fishermen work without stepping in. When a rope tangled briefly around a cleat, he freed it and handed it back. The fisherman took it and continued. No thanks spoken. None required. At the diner, he took a seat near the counter. Eggs, toast, coffee refilled without asking. The waitress nodded once when she passed. Conversation moved around him without anchoring. At the grocery store, all stayed narrow and practical. Bread, soup, apples. The clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, drizzle began and ended without committing to rain, leaving the pavement darkened and reflective. The buildings held warmth better than they showed it. Inside the library, the air stayed cool longer than the street. Light filtered through tall windows in pale bands, settling on worn tables and spines softened by use. People chose books by habit, not recommendation. They read without comment and left them where they belonged. Iris called her shop fit into this rhythm without adjustment. The storefront was narrow, its window resisting clarity unless the light hit it just right. From the street, you saw reflection first. Folk, road, movement. Only after did the interior register, quiet and contained. Inside, the air held the faint smell of pressed fabric and warmed cotton, mixed with salt that crept through old frames no matter how often they were sealed. The work table sat close to the window for daylight, not display. Tools rested where they were returned. Nothing decorative that could not justify its place. The town did not treat her shop as a gallery. It treated it as necessary. A hem fixed before Sunday. A coat seam reinforced before the cold set in. A zipper replaced before it failed completely. People came in, set an item down, explained what it needed, and did not add extra words. Iris listened, nodded, and worked. She did not ask questions that would extend the exchange. She did not comment on how something had been worn. She did the work and returned it when it was ready. Outside, winter light stayed thin. The sky rarely cleared fully. It moved between pale gray and dull white, bright enough to reveal, never enough to warm. Shadows existed without contrast. Hoarfrost clung briefly to railings and vanished by late morning. In the afternoons, drizzle sometimes fell, light and persistent, blurring edges without changing plans. People pulled collars higher. Doors closed more often than not. Sound flattened again. The road along the water bent and returned, always leading somewhere familiar. No straight lines. No shortcuts worth taking. In this town, familiarity came before closeness. Faces were known without ceremony. Names were used when needed, not before. No one asked where you were from unless you stayed long enough to matter. No one asked why you stayed unless you gave them reason. Caleb and Iris occupied the same world without intersecting it directly. He passed her shop most days. Sometimes the light was on. Sometimes it was not. Sometimes the door was open. Sometimes closed. He did not check the sign. She saw him in passing the way you notice tide tables or weather shifts. as pattern, as presence. Nothing required clarification. The bench near the bus stop held steady. The bookstore remained closed, its windows fogged from the inside. The bar near the harbor filled and emptied in slow cycles, stools, taken and freed without comment. In the evenings, when the cold deepened and the town pulled inward, lights came on behind curtains and stayed on longer than expected. Radios played low. Someone laughed, then stopped. A door closed softly. If you stood still long enough, you could feel how the town held space. Not empty. Available. Someone always noticed what happened here. A light left on late. A man standing longer than needed. A window adjusted by a fraction. No one announced the noticing. It stayed where it landed. By mid-morning, the fog usually lifted in patches. The harbor showed itself more clearly. The water stayed calm. The road curved away and returned again. The town did not rush toward meaning. It allowed things to repeat until they earned their place. Caleb continued his routes. Iris continued her work. The dock, the shop, the road, the winter light all held steady. And within that steadiness, small shifts registered without being named. The way someone might notice a chair pulled slightly closer to the window, or a sound that lingered a second longer before fading. Nothing asked to be decided yet. The world simply stayed. And that was enough to keep it moving. Caleb Rowan woke before the light committed to the day. Not night. Not morning. The hour when the Maine coast stayed suspended in gray. When the ocean sounded closer because nothing else had begun to compete with it. He lay still for a moment, listening. The steady push and pull of water reached him through the cracked window, even and unhurried. He sat up and let his feet find the cold floor without reacting to it. The room was small, built to hold warmth rather than space. Wood creaked softly as he crossed it. He opened the window wider and let the damp salt air move in. It carried no promise, just presence. The smell of water, old boards, and weather that had already passed. In the kitchen, he set the kettle on the stove. Coffee followed, whole beans kept in a plain jar, measured by habit rather than scale. He ground them slowly, the sound filling the room without demanding attention. When the water reached the right temperature, he poured it into the French press, stirred once, and stepped back. He did not watch it. While the coffee steeped, he sat at the small table near the window and opened his notebook. The pages were thick, slightly rough. He wrote a few lines, not sentences meant to explain anything. A sketch of a hinge that needed tightening. A reminder to pick up thread from the repair shop later in the week. He closed the notebook when a page felt full enough. The coffee was ready. He poured it into a single mug and carried it to the chair facing the water. From there, the ocean filled the frame, whether he looked directly at it or not. The light had shifted slightly, just enough to show the surface moving in long, unbroken lines. No beat-the-ups, no drama. He drank slowly. When the mug was empty, he rinsed it and left it upside down to dry. Then he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The coastal path was damp from overnight mist. Grass bent under the weight of moisture. Pebbles pressed into the dirt where others had walked before him. He followed the curve of the land without adjusting his pace, boots finding familiar ground. Farther along, near a stretch of rock that dipped toward the water, a small group of harbor seals rested together. Dark shapes against darker stone. One lifted its head briefly when Caleb approached, then settled again. He sat on a piece of driftwood a short distance away. He did not move closer. He did not reach for anything. He watched the water move around them, tracing the same pattern again and again until time stopped feeling like something that needed to be measured. When he stood, the cold had worked its way into his legs. He welcomed it. By the time he reached town, the morning had taken shape. The dock was awake now. Boats idled low, engines restrained. Ropes creaked against pilings. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching the thin light in dull threads. Men worked without announcing themselves, each motion placed where it belonged. Caleb stood near the edge and watched. A line had tangled around a cleat. He crouched, freed it, and handed it back. The fisherman took it and continued. No thanks spoken, none required. At the diner, Caleb took his usual seat near the counter. Eggs, toast, coffee refilled without asking. He ate slowly, not reading the paper, not filling the space with talk. The room hummed around him, familiar voices rising and falling without anchoring anywhere. Afterward, he walked to the grocery store. The aisles were narrow, practical: bread, soup, apples. At the register, the clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, drizzle had begun again, light enough to feel like air rather than rain. He stopped by the repair shop next. A jacket seam had begun to pull at the shoulder. He handed it over, explained the spot, and listened while the owner examined it. No rus, no negociation. He would pick it up when it was ready. From there, he went to the library. The building stayed cool longer than most. He returned a book and chose another without reading the back. He selected it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat at a table near the window and read until the light shifted enough to reach the page. That was his signal. He left before the room warmed. Back at the cottage, he fixed a loose hinge on the back door. The metal protested briefly, then settled. He stitched a small tear in his sweater, the repair visible but clean. He set the sweater aside and swept the porch, pushing damp leaves into a corner where the wind would eventually reclaim them. The afternoon passed without interruption. Sometimes he walked the beach again. Sometimes he stood near the water longer than planned, watching waves flatten and reform without urgency. When the wind sharpened, he closed the windows and listened to it press against the walls. On Sundays, he went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Light filtered through tall windows in narrow bands, settling on worn floors and old hymnals. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. He sat until the room felt settled, then left the way he came. No prayer spoken. No doctrine followed. Only wood, light, and the back row. In the evenings, when the town pulled inward again, Caleb sometimes went to the small bar near the harbor. He ordered soup or one drink and took a seat where he could listen without being drawn into conversation. If a chair wobbled, he tightened it. If a door stuck, he adjusted the latch. He did not announce the fixes. He paid and left. The routine was not isolated. It moved through the town and touched others without claiming them. The fisherman who nodded once. The clerk who remembered his order. The librarian who slid a book across the counter without comment. The waitress who poured coffee without asking. Caleb did not build these habits to feel calm. He kept them so nothing broke. The ocean stayed steady. The town kept its rhythm. And Caleb Rowan moved within it quietly, with the kind of capacity that did not need to be explained, only repeated. Iris Calder did not arrive as someone new. By the time Caleb Rowan noticed her clearly, the town had already placed her. Not by introduction, by repetition. She was the one who unlocked her shop early enough that the street was still unsure of itself. The one whose lights stayed on later than expected without explanation. The one people referred to by location rather than description. The designer on the bend. The window with the fabric that never looked crowded. Her shop sat between a closed bookstore and a small cafe that opened only when it felt like it. The front was narrow, wood-framed, glass slightly uneven, catching the winter light in ways that softened whatever sat behind it. Noble Sainik. Just her name, painted once and left alone. Iris moved through the town the way the tide did, predictable without being announced. On a morning when fog stayed low enough to quiet the dock, she stood outside the cafe with a paper cup warming her hands. She drank slowly, watching a delivery truck edge too close to the curb before correcting itself. When the driver stepped down to check his clearance, Iris lifted one finger and pointed. Not dramatic, just enough to redirect. The truck backed up. The moment passed. She did not stay to see if anyone noticed. Later that day, Caleb saw her at the library. She waited at the returns desk while the librarian finished with another patron. Her scarf was wrapped twice around her neck and tucked in neatly. She held a thin book under her arm, fingers resting on the spine as if to keep her place without opening it. When the desk cleared, she slid the book forward and nodded once. "Thank you," the librarian said. Iris nodded back and stepped aside. Caleb was at the table near the window. He looked up briefly as she passed, then returned to his page. She did not slow. She did not glance down to see what he was reading. She took a seat at the far end, opened her notebook, and began writing numbers in a narrow column. The room held. What marked her as safe was not warmth. It was restraint. When someone dropped a stack of papers near her table, she reached down, gathered them, and handed them back without reading a word. When a chair scraped loudly behind her, she shifted her own chair forward an inch to make room, then continued writing. No questions asked, no territory claimed. Caleb noticed these things without cataloging them. That afternoon, the wind sharpened. At the dock, Iris stood near the railing, sketchbook open, pencil moving only when the page needed it. She was not drawing the boats. She was marking proportions, distances, the way a line of rope sagged differently when wet. Caleb stood several feet away, hands resting on the rail. They did not speak. A fisherman passed between them, carrying a crate. He nodded to Iris, then to Caleb, as if the space they shared was already understood. Iris stepped back half a pace to clear the path. Caleb did the same. The crate passed through cleanly. When the fisherman returned, the space had settled again. No one adjusted it further. In town, Iris's presence showed itself in small, practical ways. She brought a torn curtain to the repair shop and explained exactly where the weight pulled wrong. She paid in cash and did not wait for change she did not need. At the grocery store, she took the last loaf from the shelf and placed it on the counter between two people instead of claiming it outright. The cashier split it without comment. At her shop, people came in and set things down. A coat, a bag, a length of cloth that had been cut badly years ago. Iris examined each item carefully. She did not ask where it had been worn. She did not ask why it mattered. She said what could be done and how long it would take. Nothing more. Caleb passed her shop most days. Sometimes the door was open. Sometimes it was not. Sometimes the light inside was warm against the gray street. Sometimes the glass reflected more than it revealed. One afternoon, he stopped across the street without meaning to. Iris was adjusting. The window. She moved a bolt of fabric no more than an inch. Stepped back, tilted her head, moved it again. The change was barely visible, but the light held differently afterward. The reflection of the street softened. Caleb did not cross. He stood where he was, hands at his sides, watching the glass rather than the woman behind it. Inside, Iris sensed the pause. She did not look out immediately. She finished smoothing the corner of a card resting in the display. No price written. No explanation offered. Just a stitched mark pressed into the paper, subtle enough to be missed unless you were already close. When she did look up, she saw him. The distance between them remained intact. She did not smile. She did not look away. She lifted her hand once, not in greeting, but toward the edge of the fabric where the light slipped again. She adjusted it, lowered her hand. The window held. Caleb nodded, as if to the balance itself. Then he stepped back half a pace. He did not leave. A woman walking her dog slowed nearby. She looked at the window, then at Caleb, then at the window again. The dog tugged forward. She said nothing and moved on. Inside, Iris turned back to her table. That was the exchange. No curiosity followed. In the evenings, Iris sometimes stopped by the small bar near the harbor. She ordered soup more often than a drink and sat with her back to the wall. She did not scan the room. She did not fill the quiet with talk. When someone spoke to her, she listened and responded only to what was asked. Caleb noticed that she never lingered in conversation. When she left cleanly. If someone had tried to place her in relation to him, the town would not have helped. She was not an answer, not a question. She was a presence that did not demand interpretation. And if there was any invitation in that, it was unspoken, the kind that exists only because no one insists on it. Iris Calder moved through the town as she always had. Caleb Rowan continued his routine. Sometimes their paths overlapped. Sometimes they did not. When they did, nothing needed to be clarified for it to feel stable. The town allowed that. It noticed, and then it let the noticing rest without deciding what it meant yet. The first contact did not happen between them. It happened through someone else. Late afternoon settled into the town without ceremony. The fog had thinned but not cleared, leaving the air damp and cool. Sounds softened at the edges. At the repair and hardware shop 2 blocks from the dock. The bell over the door rang once and stopped. Iris called her, stepped inside with a folded jacket under her arm. The shelves leaned slightly with age. Oil and old would held the room together. The radio behind the counter played low, more habit than sound. She waited while the owner finished with another customer, smoothing the sleeve of the jacket once and setting it down carefully. At the back of the shop, Caleb Rowan stood near a shallow tray of screws. He had already selected what he needed. He was comparing 2 sizes by touch, holding one in each palm, weighing them without looking. The owner stepped away to answer the phone. Iris noticed him then, not startled, just registering. She did not say his name. She did not pause long enough to invite conversation. "Excuse me," she said. Caleb shifted to the side immediately, clearing the narrow space. No apology offered. No acknowledgement required. She placed the jacket on the counter. "Seam came loose," she said. "At the shoulder." The owner returned and picked it up, turning it once. "Reinforced or closed?" he asked. "Reinforced," Iris said. "It carries weight there." Caleb glanced at the jacket. The tear was small. Clean. The kind that came from use rather than accident. "That yours?" the owner asked him. Caleb nodded. "I can have it ready tomorrow," the owner said. "That works," Caleb replied. The exchange ended. The owner carried the jacket toward the back room. The radio crackled briefly and settled. The bell rang again as someone passed outside without coming in. A pause followed. Not awkward, just unassigned. "I did not charge for the stitching," the owner called from the back. Since she pointed it out, Iris shook her head once. "Put on my tab." Caleb turned slightly toward her. "You do not have to," he said. She met his eyes briefly. "I know." Nothing else was added. They walked out at the same time. Outside, the light had thinned toward evening. The road curved toward the water, darkened by mist. Somewhere farther down the block, a door closed. A gull cried once and went quiet. "I'm heading toward the dock," Iris said. "So am I," Caleb replied. They did not adjust their pace. They walked. The dock was quieter now. Most boats were in. Nets hung still. The water moved evenly, catching what little light remained. They stopped near the railing, a few feet apart, facing the same direction. "Wind is shifting," Iris said. "Yes," Caleb answered. Nothing followed. After a moment, she spoke again. "They usually bring the fog back around dusk." He nodded. "It does not last long." They watched the water until the first layer of mist rolled in, softening the horizon. "I should get back," Iris said. "Of course." She turned, then paused. "If the shoulder gives again," she said, "bring it by earlier. That fabric responds better before it stretches." "I will," Caleb replied. She left without waiting. Caleb stayed at the railing a while longer. If someone had been watching, they might have expected more. A question, a clearer thanks, something to define what had just passed between them. None came. Nothing had been offered that required return. Nothing had been taken that needed explanation. The contact had passed through another person, through a jacket, through a task that needed doing. It did not claim a shape of its own. Later that evening, the owner would remember that the repair had been straightforward. The seam would hold. The tab would be settled the next time Iris came in. Caleb would pick up the jacket when it was ready. No one would mention the walk to the dock. No one would frame it as a beginning. It would simply be one more functional overlap in a town built on them. Enough to continue moving through the same spaces without adjusting steps. Enough to be noticed once, and then allowed to settle without being named. The shift did not announce itself. No one gathered. No one paused long enough to mark it. The town continued the way it always did, but a few small things landed differently than expected, and that was enough. It began at the dock. A crate sat near the edge of the pier, angled slightly wrong, its weight resting unevenly on one corner. Someone had dragged it there earlier and left it half-finished. The rope beside it coiled once and abandoned. The tide moved underneath. Steady and unremarked. Boats idled low, engines barely audible. Caleb Rowan stopped when he reached it. He looked at the crate without expression. He did not check for an owner. He did not scan the dock to see who might be watching. He lifted it, shifted it closer to the stack, and set it down so the base sat flat against the wood. He picked up the rope and finished the coil carefully, hand over hand, until it lay tight and clean. That was all. He moved on. A fisherman sorting nets nearby glanced up, watched for a moment, then returned to his work. No thanks. Nothing registered as out of place. Later that morning, behind the diner, a delivery arrived earlier than expected. Boxes crowded the narrow space near the back door, blocking the path. The cook stepped around them once, muttered under his breath, then disappeared inside. Caleb picked up the nearest box and moved it in. Then another. He stacked them where they belonged and stepped aside before anyone had time to comment. Thanks, the cook said, already turning back to the stove. Caleb nodded once and left. By mid-morning, the town had noticed. Not as a story, not as an event, just as a slight adjustment in the way things landed. A hinge on the post office door stopped catching when it closed. A bench near the bus stop no longer dipped when someone sat down. A loose board along the dock no longer creaked underfoot. No one praised him. No one asked why. The response was not gratitude. It was absorption. The town did not rearrange itself around the work. It simply took it in and continued. At the workshop, Iris Calder was already deep in her day. Fabric lay across the table, chalk lines faint but exact. The window was cracked open just enough to let air move through, carrying the sound of the harbor inside. The heater clicked on and off, never quite keeping up with the cold. She did not know about the crate, or the boxes, or the hinge. She knew that the light shifted earlier now, that her hands tired faster in the damp. That one sleeve on the piece in front of her still pulled wrong, no matter how many times she adjusted it. When she stepped outside for air, she saw Caleb across the street. He was kneeling beside the old bench near the bus stop. One of the slats had split down the middle. He held a thin brace beneath it with one hand while tightening a screw with the other. The work was slow, careful, unshowy. Iris watched for a moment. She did not cross the street. She did not call out. She went back inside. The bench held. Someone sat on it later without knowing it had almost given way that morning. That afternoon, Iris went to the grocery store. She carried her basket with one arm, the other free. At the end of the produce aisle, she saw Caleb again, lifting a case of bottled water onto a lower shelf that had sagged slightly. The store owner stood nearby, arms crossed. "You do not have to do that," the owner said. Caleb slid the case into place and stepped back. "It sits better this way," he replied. The owner studied the shelf for a second, then nodded once. "All right." No discount was offered. No joke followed. Iris passed them without stopping. She reached for apples, choosing the smaller ones, firm, with fewer marks. At the register, the owner mentioned the weather. She responded. The receipt printed. Outside, the wind pushed in from the water again, colder than it had been an hour earlier. Iris pulled her jacket tighter and headed back toward the workshop. She did not look back. By evening, the bar near the harbor filled with its usual crowd. Nothing special, just people who knew where to sit. Caleb took a stool near the end and ordered soup. He ate slowly. When a chair leg wobbled at the next table, he stood, crouched, and tightened the bolt beneath it. The couple sitting there barely noticed until the chair stopped moving. "Better?" one of them asked. "Yes," Caleb replied. He returned to his seat. Across the room, Iris sat with her back to the wall, a bowl of soup untouched in front of her. She had come in cold and tired, looking for heat more than company. She noticed the chair only because the room had gone briefly still around it. She looked at Caleb. He did not look back. Her response was not what the town might have expected. She did not soften. She did not approach. She did not smile in recognition or offer thanks on behalf of anyone else. When he passed her table on his way out, she spoke without turning. "You will strain your wrist if you keep using that screwdriver with your hand angled like that." He stopped, turned slightly. She continued, still not looking at him. "The handle is worn. It slips. Use the one with a wider grip." He nodded. "All right." That was it. No pras. No curiosity. No attempt to define what he had been doing. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft sound that did not linger. The town settled into night. Fog rolled in fully this time, thick enough to dampen sound. Lights blurred. Footsteps softened. At the dock, Someone tripped over a rope that should not have been there. It was not. At the workshop, Iris worked late again. The heater clicked. Fabric warmed under her hands. Outside, the bench at the bus stop held steady under the weight of a man waiting for a ride that would be late. No one spoke of the man who had fixed it. The shift was not that Caleb worked. It was that nothing changed because of it. No one elevated him. No one folded his actions into a story. The town did not turn him into something useful or symbolic. And Iris did not turn him into anything at all. She corrected a seam, undid it, started again where it pulled wrong. Across the street, a light came on and stayed on longer than expected. The town absorbed the work the way it absorbed weather. Quietly, without commentary, without assigning meaning beyond function. By morning, the dock looked the same. The store shelves held. The bench remained. And the space between two people stayed exactly as it had been, neither closing nor widening, simply accommodating the new detail without reaction. That was the first shift, not a change in direction, just the confirmation that effort did not earn position here, and attention did not require response. The town continued, and that, unexpectedly, was the point. The tension did not arrive loudly. It settled. It lived in the space where something might have been said and was not. In the way attention lingered a second longer than before, then moved on as if nothing had happened. Caleb noticed it first in the mornings. At the coffee shop, Iris stood at the counter ahead of him, waiting for her cup. Steam rose and dissolved near the ceiling. When a barista set the mug down, Iris reached for it, thanked her, and shifted slightly to the side to make room. Her eyes crossed Caleb's for less than a second, then moved past him, not away, past. It was precise enough to be intentional, neutral enough to leave no mark. Caleb stepped forward and placed his order. The grinder filled the space between them, metal against metal, steam hissing. Someone laughed near the door, then stopped. Iris carried her coffee to the table by the window and sat down. She did not open her notebook right away. She watched the street instead, fog thinning just enough to show the curve of the road, then thickening again. Caleb took his coffee outside. The chair across from her remained empty. Later that day, at the dock, they stood on opposite sides of the same railing. The tide was coming in. Small pieces of driftwood bumped lightly against the pilings. A seal surfaced, breathed once, then disappeared again without sound. Iris leaned forward, hands resting on the rail, shoulders squared. Caleb stood back, weight evenly distributed, eyes following the line where water met land. Neither spoke. The quiet stretched. Not uncomfortable, not settled either. A fisherman walked past them carrying a coil of rope. He glanced once, then kept going. The dock absorbed the moment without comment. Iris shifted first. She stepped away from the rail and adjusted the strap of her bag. Her movements were efficient, measured. She glanced toward the path leading back into town, then hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Caleb did not move. She turned and walked away. That evening, Iris worked later than usual. The heater ran longer, clicking on and off with a faint protest. Her hands moved steadily, but the fabric resisted more than it had before. A sleeve pulled. A seam refused to lie flat. She undid the stitches and started again. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the building. She stood and closed the window, latching it firmly. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Across town, Caleb sat at his small table with the notebook open in front of him. He had written nothing for several minutes. The pen rested between his fingers. The page stayed blank. He closed the notebook and set it aside. The next morning, they crossed paths at the grocery store. Iris stood near the bread shelf, comparing two loaves that looked nearly identical. Caleb approached from the other end of the aisle and stopped when he saw her there. He waited. She chose one loaf and placed it in her basket. She turned. This time their eyes met fully. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. It was not confrontation. It was recognition of something that now occupied the space between them. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning," Iris replied. The exchange held, then released. She passed him without slowing. Caleb picked up the loaf she had put back, examined it briefly, then returned it to the shelf. He chose another. That night, Fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing the streetlights whole. Sound dulled. The world narrowed. At the bar near the harbor, Iris sat alone, a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. She stared into it for a moment before lifting her spoon. Caleb entered quietly and took his usual seat near the end. They did not look at each other. The room filled with small noises. A spoon against ceramic. A chair scraping lightly against the floor. Someone coughing once and apologizing to no one in particular. Iris took a bite, then another. Caleb finished his soup and stood. As he passed her table, he slowed. Not enough to stop. Enough to be felt. "You fixed the bench well," she said, still looking at her bowl. He paused. "It needed it," he replied. She nodded once. That was all. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft sound that did not echo. Iris sat for another moment, then stood and put her bowl on the counter. She pulled on her jacket and stepped outside into the fog. The air was thick and cool, pressing gently against her face. She took a breath and let it out slowly, watching it disappear almost immediately. Across the way, Caleb stood near the water, hands in his coat pockets, looking toward where the horizon should have been. The ocean moved unseen, its sound closer now that sight had receded. He stayed there longer than necessary. The fog did not lift. It rarely did when anyone wanted it to. People in town moved more slowly that night. Doors closed with care. Footsteps softened. The harbor lights blurred into long reflections that broke and reformed with each small wave. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how both of them adjusted their pace. Not to avoid each other, not to meet, just to allow the space to remain. The tension did not ask for resolution. It asked for attention. And attention here was quiet. By morning, the fog thinned again. The road reappeared. The water resumed its visible rhythm. The space between them held, intact, breathing, unclaimed, enough to keep the day moving without forcing anything into shape. The shift came without announcement. Morning opened with thinner fog, the kind that moved in strips instead of settling all at once. The coastal path was visible in sections, revealed and hidden again as the light changed. The water stayed calm, its surface broken only by the slow, even movement that had nothing to prove. Caleb Rowan walked the path as he always did. Ahead of him, Iris Calder moved at a steady pace, jacket zipped high, hands free at her sides. He noticed her before she noticed him. He did not close the distance. He did not slow either. For several minutes, they moved the same direction, close enough to register, far enough to keep the air clear. At the bend where the path narrowed, Iris stepped aside to let him pass. Caleb stopped instead. "You can go first," he said. She shook her head slightly. "It is easier if you do." He considered this, then stepped ahead, careful not to brush past her. The moment passed without friction. Farther on, the path widened again, opening to a view of the water. Fog lifted in streaks, revealing the horizon in pieces. A seal surfaced near the rocks, then disappeared. Caleb stopped at the railing. Iris continued a few steps, then paused. She turned back. "You usually stop here," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. She hesitated, then joined him at the rail, leaving a careful space between them. They stood without speaking. The wind pressed lightly against their backs. Salt and damp would carried in from the dock. Somewhere behind them, a gull cried once and went quiet. After a while, Iris spoke. "I'm heading into town after this," she said. "I need to pick up a zipper." "All right," Caleb said. The space held. "You can walk with me if you want," she added. "Or not." He did not answer right away. He looked toward the road below, then back at the water. "I will walk part of the way," he said. They turned together. For the first time, their steps matched. They did not speak as they walked. Boots pressed into damp ground. Wind moved through low grass. A truck passed on the road below, tires hissing, then faded into fog. At the edge of town, where the path split, Iris slowed. "I turn here," she said. Caleb stopped. "So do I," he replied. They walked the next block together. At the hardware and repair shop, Iris paused. "I need to go in," she said. "I will wait outside," Caleb said. She shook her head. "You do not have to." "I know," he replied. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then wait," she said. He did. She went inside. The bell rang once. Through the window, Caleb watched her speak with the owner, hands moving as she described something small and precise. She pointed once, listened, nodded. She came back out a few minutes later with a zipper in a paper sleeve. "Thank you for waiting," she said. He nodded. Of course. They stood there without moving. The town moved around them. A door closed across the street. Someone laughed, then stopped. Fog thinned just enough to show the curve of the road. "I will walk from here," Iris said. Caleb did not step forward. "All right," he replied. She took one step, then stopped. "This is enough for now," she said, not unkindly. He met her eyes. "Yes." She turned and walked away, her pace steady, not quickened. Caleb stayed where he was until she disappeared into her workshop. He did not follow. He did not leave immediately either. The boundary had moved. Not closer, not farther, clearer. Later that day, people worked around the dock without comment. Ropes were coiled. Nets were lifted and set aside. Someone adjusted a crate and walked on. Caleb passed through without stopping. Iris worked behind the glass, the light inside her shop soft against the gray outside. The door remained closed, but not locked. The sign still read open. Nothing needed to be decided. Not yet. The space they had shared that morning did not ask for definition. It did not require an answer. It simply held, the way some moments do, leaving room for what might come next or what might not. And in that quiet allowance, the day continued. Without pressure, without conclusion. You do not have to answer yet. Movement returned in small ways. Not as urgency, not as relief, just as things that nearly needed attention, then did not. Late afternoon brought a thin wind that ran unevenly through the streets. It lifted damp leaves from the curb, then let them fall again a few feet away. Doors stayed open longer than usual. Voices carried a little farther, then dropped. The harbor moved in its steady pattern, unchanged. Caleb Rowan was walking past the old service road near the dock when he heard the scrape. Metal against stone. Then a pause. A pickup had stopped near the pier, tailgate down. A younger man stood on the bed, shifting a crate toward the edge. One corner slid faster than expected. The crate tilted, weight pulling forward. Caleb stepped closer. Not quickly, just enough to be present. The crate tipped another inch. The man caught it himself, boots braced, hands tightening around the slats. The load wobbled, then settled back into place. "I have it," the man said, breath short but steady. Caleb stopped where he was. He did not touch the crate. "All right," he replied. He stepped back. The man secured the load with a strap and jumped down. He nodded once, already turning away, and drove off. Dust lifted briefly, then fell back into the same grooves it had been in before. Caleb continued on. Nothing lingered. Across town, Iris Calder was closing the shop when a different interruption presented itself. A woman from 2 streets over stood in the doorway, holding a cracked planter, soil spilling through a split along the side. The piece had been fired 2 thin years ago, long before Iris had worked there. "It broke when I moved it," the woman said. "I thought you might fix it." Iris turned the planter once in her hands. "It will not hold water again," she said. "I know," the woman replied. "It just needs to sit." Iris nodded. She set the planter on the counter and reached for a cloth. "I can bind it," she said. "The crack will still show." "That is fine." No more was said. Iris wrapped the piece and marked it with a date and a single word. "Bind. No rescue. No rosterastion." Just enough to keep it from breaking further. That evening, the wind picked up again. A loose sheet of tin on a neighboring roof rattled, lifting at one corner. The sound traveled down the block, sharp and uneven. Caleb heard it as he passed. He stopped beneath the roofline and looked up. The corner lifted higher, caught by the wind. For a moment, it seemed possible it might tear free. Caleb reached toward the ladder, leaning against the wall. Then he stopped. The ladder was not his. A man emerged from the house below the roof, already climbing, tool belt low on his hips. He secured the sheet quickly, working before the wind shifted again. Caleb stepped back into the shallow shade. The sound stopped. He walked on. At the same time, Iris was in the workshop, setting shelves for the next day's work. A stack leaned heavier than she liked. She considered removing one piece. She did not. Instead, she shifted the position by a fraction, redistributing the weight without changing the load. The shelf held. She checked it once more, then moved on. Outside, a gust pushed mist against the window, briefly blurring the street. When it cleared, Caleb was passing, already moving away. Iris did not look up. The evening unfolded without punctuation. People gathered on porches. Someone laughed, then stopped. A radio played low and was turned off again. The temperature dropped just enough to invite movement. Caleb stopped by the small bar near the harbor. Inside, the air was warmer. Lights were low. He ordered soup and sat at the end of the counter. A man 2 stools down knocked his glass with his elbow. Liquid spread across the wood, creeping toward Caleb's sleeve. Caleb lifted his arm and shifted back. The bartender wiped the spill before it reached him. "Sorry," the man said. "It is fine," Caleb replied. He did not help clean. He did not comment. Across the room, Iris stood near the door, having stopped in briefly to drop off the bound planter for the woman who would collect it later. She saw Caleb at the counter and paused. He did not look up. She set the package down, exchanged a few words with the bartender, and left. Outside, the air had cooled further. Folk ditkenet, Zweilövin en Yis. Iris tightened the strap of her bag and walked on. Caleb finished his soup and paid. He stepped out a moment later, the door closing softly behind him. They did not cross paths. Near the edge of town, a streetlight flickered and steadied. Caleb adjusted his route to avoid the uneven patch beneath it. Iris took the longer way around a block where water pooled after dusk. The motifs accumulated quietly. A crate that almost fell. A roof that nearly lifted. A spill that did not spread. A planter that would never be whole again. Each moment carried the shape of intervention, then released it. Nothing resolved into a story. Nothing required acknowledgement. The town absorbed the motion and returned to stillness. Later that night, Iris shut down the lights in the workshop and let the heat fade on its own. She did not reopen anything to check. She trusted the order she had set. Caleb sat on his porch and drank water slowly, measuring intake by habit rather than thirst. The wind eased. The fog thinned. The near rescues did not complete. They were not meant to. They passed through the day like weather, leaving no mark, only confirming that things could hold without being saved. The town rested, and underneath, its quiet motion continued. The consequence arrived quietly. It did not announce itself as a problem. It did not gather witnesses. It appeared as a small detail placed slightly wrong, then left there long enough to be repeated once. On a gray afternoon, Iris Calder stood at the counter of the repair and hardware shop, waiting for change. The bell over the door rang behind her. She heard boots on the worn floor, then the brief pause that meant someone had stopped to look for something specific. The owner slid the coins across the counter. "Your friend was in earlier," he said, without emphasis. Iris looked up. "My friend." The owner nodded toward the back room. "The man with the coat. The one who fixed the bench." Iris did not respond immediately. She gathered the coins and closed her fingers around them, the metal cool against her palm. "He asked if the zipper came in yet," the owner added. "Said he might come back later." Iris slipped the coins into her pocket. "He did not need to ask," she said. The owner shrugged. "Just thought I would tell you." She nodded once and stepped outside. The wind pressed in from the water, colder than it had been that morning. Iris stood on the step for a moment longer than necessary, jacket collar pulled up, eyes on the street without focusing on anything in particular. Friend. The word did not echo. It did not demand correction. It simply stayed where it had landed. Later that evening, Iris saw Caleb Rowan near the dock. He stood where he usually did, hands resting on the railing, looking out toward the water. Fog moved in low layers, thinning and thickening without pattern. The light was already fading. She approached and stopped a few feet away. "You were at the shop," she said. "Yes," Caleb replied. She waited. "They mentioned you asked about the zipper." He nodded. "I did." "You did not need to," she said. "I know." The space between them held. "They called you my friend," Iris said. Caleb did not answer right away. He looked out toward the water, then back. "Did they?" he said. "Yes." Another pause. "That is not something I said," he replied. "I know," Iris said. No correction followed. No reassurance. The misinterpretation was acknowledged, then left where it was. The water moved steadily below them. A gull cried somewhere out of sight and went quiet again. The next morning, Iris worked with the shop door closed. Not locked, just closed. The sign still read open, but the glass reflected more of the street than it revealed of the inside. The heater ran longer than usual, filling the room with an even sound. Caleb passed the workshop that afternoon and noticed the door. He did not slow. He walked on. At the grocery store, the owner greeted Iris by name and asked if she wanted the usual. She nodded. When Caleb entered a few minutes later, the owner mentioned the weather and nothing else. At the bar that evening, Iris chose a table farther from the door. Caleb took his usual stool. They were not avoiding each other. They were adjusting. When Caleb stood to leave, he passed her table without slowing. Iris watched the door close behind him, then returned to her soup. The consequence showed itself again 2 days later. A delivery truck arrived late, blocking part of the street near the workshop. The driver struggled to maneuver a pallet jack over uneven pavement. Caleb approached and slid a board beneath the wheel, leveling it just enough for the jack to roll. The driver nodded and continued. From inside the workshop, Iris saw the motion through the window. She did not step outside. She finished the seam she was working on and pressed it flat, the iron hissing softly. That night, the fog came in thick and early. Iris chose the shorter way home. At the bend where the path narrowed, she saw Caleb ahead. He noticed her behind him and stepped aside, offering space. She passed without comment. Neither of them turned. Nothing had been said that needed to be taken back. Nothing had been done that required repair. But one small detail had been repeated once, and that was enough to change the way weight settled. The town continued as it always did. The bench held. The fence stayed steady. The fog lifted and returned. And between them, something adjusted its line. Not breaking. Not resolving. Just finding a new place to hold. Not farther apart. Not closer. Just different. And for now, that difference remained. The realization did not arrive as a thought Caleb Rowan could follow. It arrived as a change in what he did not do. The morning after the small misalignment, the town opened itself carefully. The sky stayed low and pale, not storming, not clearing. Light settled where it always did, thin along the water, dull against the buildings. The harbor moved in its steady rhythm, tapping the pilings without variation. Caleb woke before the light reached the window. The routine was familiar. Kettle, coffee, the chair by the glass. But the order felt altered, as if one step had slipped forward and another had fallen away without changing the shape of the whole. He opened the window and listened to the water move. The sound felt closer than it had before, or perhaps he was standing nearer to it. He poured the coffee and sat. He drank more slowly than usual, letting it cool in his hands. When he reached for the notebook, he opened it, turned a page, then another. He stopped on a blank one and left it that way. Outside, a fishing boat passed without a gull following it. Caleb stood and pulled on his coat. The route toward town lay open in front of him, efficient and known. He knew where the pavement dipped, where the shade held longer, where he would arrive before the street filled. He had walked that path often enough that his body expected it. He did not take it. Instead, he turned right toward the longer curve that followed the edge of the road before bending back. Fewer people used it. Less visibility. The kind of route chosen when there was no need to be seen. He did not check the time. By the time he reached the post office, the line had already formed. He waited without shifting his weight. When his turn came, he mailed the package and stepped back into the street. The light had not changed much. The workshop door was open when he passed it later. Iris Calder stood inside near the counter, hands dusted with chalk, attention on a stack of fabric cooling beneath cloth. The empty hook in the window still held its place. The light inside was warm against the gray outside. Caleb slowed. Then he kept walking. Inside, Iris noticed the movement at the edge of the glass. She looked up in time to see his reflection pass and dissolve as the light shifted. She did not step toward the door. She did not call out. She went back to her work. At the grocery store, Caleb picked up bread and apples. The mineral salts had arrived again. He took one packet and left the rest. The clerk rang him up without comment. Outside, the wind pushed in off the water, carrying mist that softened the edges of buildings and people alike. Caleb adjusted his coat and headed home by the longer route again. The house stayed cool enough. He closed the shutters earlier than usual and sat by the window, watching the light narrow across the floor. When metallic sound came from down the block, he stood automatically. Then he stopped. The sound resolved on its own. Someone else had already secured whatever had shifted. The noise faded. Caleb remained where he was. Later, when the heat eased, he walked again, this time toward the edge of town where the houses thinned and the road dipped. He sat on a low wall and watched the sun drop without checking where its light fell. Across town, Iris adjusted her schedule. She moved one fitting to the following day and erased another entirely. The chalk left a faint trace on the board. She left it there. When she stepped outside to lock up, she saw Caleb farther down the street, walking, away from the workshop rather than toward it. She noted the direction. She did not interpret it. The next day followed the same pattern. Caleb chose the longer route again. He passed the workshop only after the busiest hours had thinned the street. When he did not stop. He did not look in. Iris saw him anyway. She was kneading fabric at the back table, weight forward, hand steady. She glanced up through the open door and saw him cross the street without slowing. Her hands did not pause. At midday, Caleb stopped by the diner. Iris was already there, seated near the window. Caleb took a seat at the counter instead of the stool 2 spaces away. He ordered and waited. When Iris finished, she stood and paid. "I will head out," she said, not to him but to the room. Caleb nodded without turning. Outside, she walked toward the workshop. Caleb waited a full minute before leaving in the opposite direction. The town absorbed the change without comment. No one remarked on Caleb's altered path. No one asked Iris why the door stayed open later or closed earlier than before. The rhythms adjusted themselves around the new spacing. In the late afternoon, Iris stood at the window and adjusted the display. Not the fabric, the light. She shifted the angle by a fraction so the glass reflected less of the street. The interior became clearer from inside than from out. She stepped back and considered it. The empty hook remained. Across town, Caleb sat on his porch and repaired a loose strap on his bag. He tightened the buckle and tested it once, then set the bag aside. He did not think about where he would carry it next. When evening came, the heat released its hold. People emerged again, quieter now. Doors opened. Radios turned on and off. Conversation drifted without gathering. Caleb walked past the workshop one last time that day. The lights were on inside. Iris stood at the table, hands busy, posture steady. She did not look up. Caleb slowed. He stopped. He did not step closer. Iris felt the pause and looked up. They met each other's eyes through the open space. Not searching, not waiting. She nodded once. He returned the nod. Then he stepped back and continued on. The choice was complete. Not to approach. Not to intervene. Not to place himself where his presence was no longer necessary. Iris did not follow him with her eyes. She finished what she was doing and set it aside to rest. The town cooled as it always did. The water kept its rhythm. Lights came on and stayed on a little longer than expected. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how Caleb's role shifted without announcement. He still moved through the same places. He still repaired what needed holding. But he no longer reached first. He allowed the town to carry itself. And Iris, without comment, respected the adjustment. She did not close the door to mark it. She did not open it wider to invite it. She left it exactly as it was. The street held its quiet order. The water moved and moved on. And somewhere between routes taken and routes avoided, the shape of things became accurate. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been confessed. Nothing had been clarified out loud. But a role had settled into place. Caleb no longer measured his days by usefulness. He moved when needed. He stayed when not. The town did not require more. The space remained open enough to pass through. And for now, that was sufficient. Morning returned the way it always did. Gray first, then a thin band of light settling along the water. Not bright enough to promise anything. Only enough to show what was already there. The ocean moved in its steady rhythm. The docks held. The road curved and disappeared into mist exactly where it always had. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the window. The routine remained. The kettle, the coffee, the chair by the glass. But the order had shifted. He opened the window, first this time, letting the damp air move through the room before touching anything else. The sound of the water came in low and even. He stood longer than usual, then turned away. He prepared the coffee without watching it. While it brewed, he folded a sweater he had repaired days earlier and placed it back on the shelf instead of leaving it on the chair. When the coffee was ready, he poured it and drank half of it standing. The notebook stayed closed. Outside, the coastal path held the same damp softness underfoot. Grass bent with moisture. Pebbles pressed into the dirt where others had walked before him. He followed the curve of the land, but when he reached the place where he usually stopped to sit, he kept going. Farther along, the seals rested on the rocks, as they often did. Dark shapes against darker stone. One lifted its head briefly when he passed, then settled again. Caleb slowed, then continued without sitting. By the time he reached town, the morning had taken shape. The dock was awake. Boats idled low. Ropes creaked against pilings. Nets hung stiff with salt. Caleb watched from a distance, hands in his coat pockets. A line lay slightly out of place near the edge of the pier. He saw it. He did not move toward it. Someone else stepped in, lifted the rope, and finished the coil. The motion was quick and unremarked. The dock returned to its quiet pattern. At the diner, Caleb took his usual seat, but later than before. Eggs arrived. Toast. Coffee refilled without asking. He ate steadily, leaving nothing behind. When he stood to leave, he pushed the chair in more carefully than necessary. At the grocery store, he picked up bread, soup, apples. At the register, the clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, still damp, still gray. He walked past the workshop on his way back. The door was open. Iris Calder stood inside, near the front table, adjusting a length of fabric laid out to cool. The light inside her shop fell differently now, angled so the interior read clearly from within, less so from the street. Caleb did not slow. Inside, Iris noticed him anyway. She watched his reflection pass through the glass, stretch briefly, then disappear as the light shifted. She returned to her work without turning toward the door. Her day moved with familiar tasks in a new sequence. She cut fabric before checking notes. She pressed seams before adjusting the lamp. The work held. When she stepped outside for air, the fog had thinned enough to show the harbor clearly. Boats moved in and out. The bench at the bus stop held steady under the weight of a man waiting. She stood for a moment, then went back inside. In the afternoon, Caleb went to the library. He returned the book he had finished and chose another from a shelf he rarely touched. He selected it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat near the window and read until the light reached the page. He left without looking back. On Sunday, he went to the church again. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked softly. Light fell in narrow bands across worn floors. He sat until the room settled, then stood and left the way he came. No prayer spoken. No doctrine followed. Only wood, light, and the back row. That evening, Iris closed the shop earlier than she had the week before. Not because she was finished, because the work could wait. She turned the sign and locked the door. She did not check the street before walking away. They crossed paths later on the coastal road. Iris walked toward town. Caleb walked away from it. The wind pressed against their coats. They slowed slightly as they passed. Evening, Iris said. Evening, Caleb replied. They continued on. The town settled as it always did. Lights came on behind windows and stayed on a little longer than expected. The bar near the harbor filled, then emptied. Fog rolled in and out without urgency. At the dock, the water tapped gently against the pilings. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how the same places now carried different weight. The same routes, taken in a different order. The same work, approached without filling every gap. Maine stayed quiet. The ocean stayed steady. And within that stillness, routine returned. Not unchanged, just accurate. The town did not change its position. It stayed where it had always been, held between water and weather, between routines that repeated and small choices that adjusted them without notice. Morning continued to arrive without ceremony. Fog still moved in when it wanted to. The harbor kept its steady breath, indifferent to who paused long enough to hear it. Caleb Rowan stood near the edge of the pier one evening as the light thinned. Not waiting, not watching for anyone in particular. Just there, hands resting on the rail, feeling the temperature drop the way it always did after dusk. A boat passed farther out, engine low, leaving a line on the water that smoothed itself away almost immediately. Across town, Iris Calder turned off the lights in her workshop one by one. The warmth from the day lingered in the wood and fabric, releasing slowly. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped into the street, choosing the longer route home without considering it. The road curved. The sound of the water followed. They did not meet that night. They did not need to. The bench at the bus stop held steady. The repaired fence along the coastal path stayed firm. The bar near the harbor filled and emptied as it always did, stools taken and freed without ceremony. On some afternoons, the church doors stood open, quiet inside, wood and light doing their work without instruction. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been lost. What had settled was simpler than an answer. Work mattered because it was done, not because it was seen. Distance carried respect as often as it carried space. Presence did not require explanation to be real. Caleb returned to his routines with one fewer gesture and found that nothing collapsed without it. Iris continued her work without filling every pause, and the forms still held. The town adjusted around them quietly, the way it always did, making room without comment. There was no ending to announce, no promise made, no direction closed. The road remained open in both directions. Some nights a light would stay on longer than expected. Some nights it would not. Someone might pause outside a window. Someone else might keep walking. Both would be allowed. The town stayed. And if someone chose to linger with it a little longer, no one hurried them on.